That was exciting. I'm very excited that I get to be lazier because Veland's team is going to do all the work with that AI and cloud integration into my automation. Really, really excited about that. But I'm also very excited about our next panel. So we've all heard about open source. Many of us are using it. It's something I do every day. But there's a new trend in the industry called InnerSourcing. And to talk about that, please welcome my good friends, Kris Messina, Kris Borchers, and PJ Hagerty. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Remember me? I was here this morning. I was that guy. I'm back again. I'm here with Kris Borchers and Kris Messina. We're going to do a little talk about open source. If you don't remember, my name is PJ Hagerty. I run a company called DevRelate.io, Developer and Community Relations as a Service. I've been a developer for several years, a lot of that time working in the open source space. And a lot of the startups that I work with are very open source driven. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves as well?
Sure. So I'm Kris Messina. I actually started my career in 2004 working on the launch of Firefox. And I've done a lot of work in just the open source and open standards world in general. And in 2007, I gave away the hashtag to the internet. And so that's one of my contributions.
Nice. And I'm Kris Borchers. I've been working in open source forever. Started my career in that at Red Hat. Have been running jQuery Foundation, JS Foundation, working for the Linux Foundation, and now, as of about 3 weeks ago, moved to Microsoft to help them bring open source fundamentals internal, which we call InnerSource.
Right, and I think that's where we should start. There's a lot of companies that use open source, and I think most people here understand what open source is. What makes a company want to get involved in open source or use open source to build products, to build applications? Like, what's the want there? What's the need?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different reasons that a company would use open source. So, I mean, it's everything from just the simple answer is it's free code. So it's a cost-saving mechanism. But I mean, there's all kinds of other reasons. Some companies even use it for recruiting, right? So they'll put a project out there, and actually, maybe that's not the reason they released the code, but they start seeing potential new hires in their contributors. And it's more than just technical skills that you learn from something like that. You learn that these people can collaborate with other people. They can collaborate remotely, things like that. So,
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that too. Like, it's also a way of pulling in culture from outside of an organization into a company, inside the company. Mm-hmm. Or like you said, it's also a good way of recruiting people, of saying, we use this code base, and so if you're already familiar with it, you can hit the ground running inside the company. And it's a way of actually having a dialogue, I think, with the outside world, and seeing what's going on, catching trends, innovating, and thinking differently about the problems that you're solving based on what a large community of people are actually thinking about.
Yep.
So now, I feel like the things that we've already touched on here, what you've both been saying, is really focused on the startup. And do you feel that part of the reason why startups really get involved in open source is it is the quickest route to an MVP, to a minimal viable product? You don't have to worry about licensing and paying specific fees for specific software. You can just build it yourself, worry about the community contribution later, but get to that point where you're selling something.
Yeah, for sure.
Actually, I don't know if I don't know if I totally agree. I think licensing actually is an important thing in terms of selecting software or code that has an appropriate license for what your business is, and also thinking about from a competitive or economic perspective, what is the actual intellectual assets that you're producing in your company? If it is code, if it's algorithms, if it's things of that nature, how dependent do you want to be on external software versus building it in-house and having your own internal expertise, which actually becomes a competitive necessity over time. So being strategic about what you do choose to use and what you don't choose to use actually is a big conversation, I think, to have with the core engineering team.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I mean, especially when we talk about startups, I mean, a lot of the startups that I've worked with that are open sourcing things, what they find really useful is you're almost always having to build sort of like code around your product, right? Whether it's infrastructure tools or things like that that help your business get off the ground. Those are great things to open source because they're not your secret sauce, right? They're not the product. And so if you can get help maintaining those, improving those, and you have more time to focus on your product, that's a big advantage.
Absolutely. So now there's kind of, because you mentioned the things that aren't integral to your product are great to open source, but there are those things that are integral to your product
Sure.
that you might still build with open source solutions, but you kind of make it your own, and that's kind of what we look at as InnerSource. Would you agree it's kind of where the line crosses over, where open source is brought into the enterprise, or even in the startup level, and something's created that is not exactly the same free, open to everyone version that you can just go and grab a GitHub repo kind of thing. Now it's behind a company line somewhere. Would you get this kind of a good general idea of what InnerSource is?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think InnerSource, like the super simple definition is just taking sort of open source fundamentals, collaboration, sharing code, version control, things like that, and bringing it into sort of your teams within the organization so that they can better collaborate, especially from what I've seen in larger organizations. That becomes really important to help with preventing reinventing the wheel, right? Like if you look at, I mean, there's teams that can be like literally across the room and they're building two different tools that do the exact same thing because they don't know the other folks are working on it, right? So, so the idea is if you can get that more open sort of methodology internally so that people know what's going on, it will improve efficiency and help your teams collaborate better.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I would say, though, is it depends on the size of the organization, right? Like, if you're a small startup and the entire engineering team can, like, look across the table or go into Slack and talk to everyone else that's working on stuff, you're going to be able to know much more quickly what's going on.
Yep.
But like, for example, when I was working at Uber on the developer platform, we first started using a third-party documentation tool, and then over time realized that actually it was going slower than we would have been able to go ourselves because we had the engineering resources. So then we took on building our own internal documentation tool, which then led to us publishing those docs, but then we had to maintain it and build it ourselves. So there is a bit of I think a consideration to think about how much do you want to bite off? Is it part of your core competency and the value that you're actually creating? And then what happens when you want to share out your code or your resources to then hand off, I guess, the things that you've built to someone else to maintain it, let's say, after it's no longer strategically necessary for you to be putting gas on the fire, so to speak.
Right, so in some ways, the use of InnerSource inside an organization kind of boils down to the same reasons why you're using open source. You want to recruit the best people and make your product better, so maybe you bring them into the InnerSource team. You want to save a little bit of money, so maybe you have a nice InnerSource team that's building something. But I think what you spoke to, Kris, who's closer to me, let's be clear. What you said, Kris, is like when you were working at Uber, you had the resources.
Yeah.
And is that the real key to building InnerSource within an organization is you have to make sure you have the resources to maintain things before you go ahead and, even push forward into open source?
Yeah, I mean, like, in our particular case, we were frustrated by the pace of the development of this other tool, but then we ended up having to fix all the bugs and all the small stuff that this other third-party developer was doing before. So you also have to be very aware that staffing up is actually not only like a big expense, but also something you have to anticipate and do your kind of own internal developer relations to promote what you're building, and to your point, to create more visibility and awareness and transparency. Say, look, here are the other teams that are working on similar things. Why don't you guys get together? If it makes sense to not pair up and actually work separately to move quickly to see how quickly you can get a solution out there and then compete, that actually can be really good. I know at Google, we did a lot of internal competition between different teams who were building the same things. So Google was competing with itself as opposed to competing with outsiders. And that was actually a good example of kind of the InnerSource model where all the code was available and it was visible to all Google engineers, but you still need to stay focused. You still need to solve your own problems, and you still need to build a product that's really good, that works. And so having that focus is a piece of the mix, as well as, again, being aware of or tracking the solutions that are happening inside of your company.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I mean, I think definitely it's good process to compete internally, right? I mean, but as long as you have that sort of open-minded approach that when it becomes clear that maybe one of them is winning, now you collaborate on that one, and you don't keep competing and sort of.
Well, and so I think actually to this point, like that's where you need both culture and leadership that understands that you are going to have like these sort of like 300 moments, 300 like the movie, like where you sort of like get up and you're like fighting and you're like, okay, this one won and thank you very much, I have lost, and your project now goes forward, as opposed to harboring some resentment that then like shows up later when people can't collaborate. So you have to know that that's a possibility. You have to have leadership that's willing to acknowledge the contributions that the team whose projects maybe is getting folded into the other one made, and then provide opportunities for those people to continue working on projects that they find are interesting or compelling or that they're personally passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're saying more collaboration, less this is Sparta.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, you pull too many of the like this is Sparta moments, and you're gonna end up like the 300 movie.
Exactly, and I think this actually speaks a little bit to, we have a couple Slido questions up here, and that first one I think is a perfect example. How do you handle the culture change in the company where project ownership is kind of obsessive, meaning the owner team hesitate to bring in contributions from other teams? And I know I worked in organizations where this is true, so I'll kind of start to speak to that one. It is very difficult when you have a team that's insulated and non-collaborative, and they feel that they have ownership over a piece of it. But that kind of also negates the spirit of the idea of either open source or InnerSource. It's supposed to be something people can work on and collaborate. So that's a culture change that has to actually start somewhere higher up the chain. That's a toxic environment, really.
Yeah, and I mean that's the exact reason I moved to Microsoft, is to help some of those teams through that culture shift, right? And so we're still working out plans and figuring out how best that works for us. But I mean, there's things you can do, right? Like I think you were mentioning, recognizing and rewarding those contributions as much as you would if they built it themselves, right? And then implementing different, systems where we reward or give them this idea of like an achievement. Basically, we're working on gamifying some of it, where they're encouraged to contribute. And then on top of that, you have to have sort of this management buy-in where they're going to be willing to either give their team time to contribute to other teams. They have to give up some of that "this is mine" mentality to reap those benefits. And so the managers have to be willing to both give time to them to contribute to other tools that they might be using, as well as review and accept contributions from other teams. That has to be worked into their process.
So I have a question about that. I mean, you're going into a big, competitive content. Well, you are now. You're within Microsoft. I can only imagine what that culture is like. I've never worked at Microsoft. But coming from like, the Linux Foundation, the open source world, I can imagine, and there's been plenty of cases where, in my experience with like the Drupal community or open WordPress community, there'll be like a module or there'll be a plugin that then gets taken into like the core code base, right? And maybe there were multiple different versions of the same plugin or the same functionality, and you have a group of people who are like, well, shit, man, I've been spending like 3 years building this, and my thing isn't getting put into the main tree or whatever. How do you, I guess, maybe work with management or with teams, or again, as you're going into Microsoft, to sort of start thinking differently about the ego that seems necessary to sort of get ahead in a large company? How do you change that mentality?
I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I think really what we're focusing on right now is trying to show them the benefits that they will get from releasing some of that ego, and show them the efficiencies that they can have by contributing and working with these other teams on something rather than continuing to maintain their own. And it's early, right? So we're still working on building those baselines to figure out how we show some of that improvement.
And I guess I'm curious, this is my last question about this.
That's okay, I'm comfortable here. Go ahead.
How much is also about like either creating space or having like an empathetic response as opposed to a rational response?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the first things we're doing is actually implementing just some training. And one of the first, I mean, it's going to be multiple courses, and like one of the first courses is just, this is how open source works. and empathy is part of that, right? And so really getting people to understand the human side of it as opposed to just the tech will be early on in that training.
Yeah. I think, it's funny because the key word there was empathy. And I know we're talking a lot about, large companies, Microsoft, the IBM, the Googles, contributing to open source. And there's an interesting question that we have here is, how does a larger company financially support open source contributors? I know from my perspective, I worked in the open source world for a while. I was a big Ruby developer for a while. And there's a wonderful organization called Ruby Together that helps coordinate, donations to people who are building Bundler or building the Ruby Gems ecosystem. PHP has a foundation for Composer and some of the other frameworks that are out there. There's the Python Foundation. How does a company like a Microsoft or a Google, is it just like, do they just write a check, or are there other ways that they can contribute financially and otherwise to open source?
So, I have opinions on this. You've listed a number of different ways. There's the different crowdfunding models that people have started doing to support their open source work. They've had different amounts of success. Honestly, the best way that I've seen large organizations financially support these people is by hiring them. The problem is those people have to be willing to maybe do a little bit more than just work on their open source project. In most cases, sometimes they'll hire them and say, just go work on that because it's something we use, it's something we need. You just keep working on that and we'll pay you. A lot of times it's like, come in, spend half of your time on that and half of your time on client work or whatever, right? But I think you see that, and that goes back to where I was talking about open source as a sort of recruiting tool. But we do see a lot of people sort of use, like their GitHub is their resume now, because it's really easy for hiring managers to go out, look at what they've been contributing to, see how they interact with people, and then bring them in for an interview.
Actually another thing too, and this is maybe more about outer open source, I guess, but like Uber actually open sourced a lot of really interesting technology. And one, you have to have people within the organization that believe that that's actually necessary, useful. And so it's sort of an indirect way of financially using the resources of the company to then produce more open source code that then powers or gives other open source developers the ability to expand the capacity or the tools that they're already building to make their offerings more compelling or more complete. And so part of it is also about just being aware of what's going on outside the organization and working to contribute meaningful things which are being, let's say, built inside and then making them available for the world to use.
Now, I'm pretty sure we could probably go on about this for another half hour or so. But we are running out of time. So in the last minute or so here, any final thoughts on open source, InnerSource, or how to get involved, what companies should do?
Wow. Open source, obviously, depending on where you are in terms of if you work for a large organization or startup or whatever, we talked about the benefits of open source. There's a lot of value in just getting involved. It's figuring out, just go use something, right? And then fix something in it, and just get a feel for what it's like to be a part of the open source culture. And that's when you'll start, I think, realizing where it can best impact your business, both from a consumption and contribution point of view.
Yeah, the thing that I would say is I got involved with open source like 15 years ago, and back then it was like a communist plot to take over the capitalist world. And I think we won, but now that this is like so normal in organizations, it's also about giving individual employees, and I think that there's a lot more employment mobility assumptions now, the ability for employees to show the work that they've done, to take that work that they've done perhaps internally, make it available to the outside world, and then point to it and say, this is the work that I did. And I think that's actually incredibly important for both retaining talent as well as recruiting new employees.
Awesome. Well, I think the message here is go out there, get involved, shout about your open source projects, both at work and in the community. Kris, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.